Hi, I'm Simeon Floyd, and I'm going to talk to you today about the lexicon as a window on Quechuan expansion in Amazonia. Research done together with my colleagues Georgia Ennis, Joshua Homan, and Nick Emlin. So Quechua has spread into the Amazonian lowlands since the colonial period in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru due to a complex historical process of missionization, colonization, labor and resource exploitation, voluntary and forced migrations. And this history is only partially understood. So here we're going to try to understand it better using a quantitative lexical comparison. To give a little bit more background, although Amazonian Quechuas are mostly spoken in Ecuador and bordering areas of Colombia and Peru today, Quechua languages were spoken much more broadly across the Peruvian Amazon historically. And we can see this because there's many Quechuan toponyms, because of the wide influence on Amazonian Spanish, and because of historical documentation that shows us that Quechuan languages were used, for example, together with Tucanoan languages in what would become Ecuador, were used together with Hebera and other languages on the Marañón area that would become Peru. It was used as the general language of the colonial province of Minas, covering much of this colonial Amazonian territory. And it was even used up until the late 19th century in areas of Colombia where it's not used today, far to the north, for example, in Almaguer near Popoyan. And it was also used on the Ucayali River, where it's not spoken today, in contact with Panoan languages. And we can see this in the 1903 document from Navarro, which I'm going to mention again later on because it's one of the key varieties to compare to the other ones in this area. It was also used in central Peru, for example, in this document where it was in contact with Yanesha, but this variety of Quechua appears to be related, for example, to Huánuco and the central Peruvian Quechuas, and there's not enough data on these ones to include them here. And there's no Quechua spoken to the south in the southern areas today, except for recent migration. Recent migration has been continuous up in from the colonial times to present. There's documentation of the Saraguro people colonizing the Ecuadorian Amazon and coming into contact with Shuar people. Down in the south around Cuzco, there's continuous Quechuan migration and contact with Amazonian peoples there. In Bolivia, there's a transitional Amazon Andean zone that Quechuan speakers move around in. So this process keeps going on today. In Ecuador, we can see that the main Quechua-speaking area goes down the Andean highlands and then also extends out along the Amazonian rivers to the southeast. And in Colombia, we can see that the area is mostly along the Ecuadorian border, both in the highlands and into the lowlands. In Peru, we can see two distributions. One, the languages come down the rivers from Ecuador. So these are related to Napo, Pastaza, the Ecuadorian varieties. And then we see another concentration in San Martin department. So these are the languages that we're going to look at in the study. We're going to look at Colombian Ingano, Highland and Lowland Quechua. We're going to look at a variety of Lowland Quechua on the Peruvian side of the Pastaza River, known as Inga. We will look at Chachapoyas Quechua, San Martin or Lamas Quechua, known by its speakers as Yacuash. We will look at the 1903 document from Ucayali Quechua, and we'll also look at the southern varieties that are claimed to be relevant for these varieties for Poyas Lamas branch. And it has been claimed that they are not closely related to the Cusco Quechuas, either historical or modern. We'll be concluding the 17th century and modern varieties here. What methods do we use? Well, inspired by Dr. Bowen's position that Swadesh lists are not long enough, the traditional 100-word Swadesh list doesn't seem to be quite enough to do a number of kinds of comparisons. So we decided to use a 400-word list instead. This list was composed by the traditional Swadesh list and in its extended form of about 200 items, plus any terms from the Leipzig-Jakarta list that were not already included, plus more terms from an Andes Amazonian specific list that includes things like regional flora and fauna terms. And there have been a couple of previous quantitative studies of the Quechuan family, but none of them that have included all of these varieties. So this is completely unstudied area. And there's many ways to look at a large data set like this, lexical, phonological, semantic. But here we're going to start with what we can learn from basic lexical cognition. So here are the results, and that's a lot to take in, but we can zoom in on the different sections. You see we have variation between 30% variation between the two most different varieties and 6% variation between the two most similar. Now, the most similar varieties, somewhat surprisingly, are Santo Tomas, the historical Santo Tomas, and the historical Cusco Quechua, claimed to be two entirely separate branches of Quechua known as 2B and 2C. It looks like in the colonial period, these two languages were almost identical lexically. The next most similar languages are also the southern ones. So the modern Cusco Quechua is quite similar to historical Cusco Quechua, obviously, but also to the Quechua of Santo Tomas. And then beyond that, you begin to see some of the regional connections, like the relations between highland and lowland Ecuador, or between highland Chachapoyas and lowland Llamas. But what you do not see is connections among these different groups. And those are all at the highest rate of variation. So when you look across the Ecuadorian languages into the Peruvian languages, we see very high rates of variation. We can break it down a little bit. So here is the northern group of Ecuadorian languages, and we see that consistently they are mostly related to each other, especially Quechua. So we find that Highland Quechua is most closely related to Lowland Quechua. Lowland Quechua is most closely related to Highland Quechua, and they are not particularly closely related to Chachapoyas or Llamas. They are more closely related to Cusco Quechua lexically than Chachapoyas and Llamas Quechua. If we look at the Chachapoyas Llamas group, we see that, again, they are most closely related to each other. So Chachapoyas is closely related to the historical Ucayali branch, and Llamas is closely related to Chachapoyas. But again, we find that they are very different from the northern Ecuadorian and Colombian Quechuas. If we look at the southern varieties and the historical varieties, we see again that they're closely related amongst each other. So Cusco, historical and modern, and Santo Tomas are closely related to each other, and they're more distantly related to the others. Now, when we break it down and look at some examples, we find correspondences in every direction. We find examples like the two words for man, which are used in Cusco and in Santo Tomas in historical documents, seem to have been taken up. One of them, Cardi by Ecuador, and Uyku for the Chachapoyas Llamas group. And then the Chachapoyas Llamas group is going along with the southern group to the exclusion of Ecuador, but actually they seem to be a bit shallow. So for example, Runtu for hail is shared between the southern ones and the central ones, but Ecuador actually has the word Runtu. It just doesn't mean egg, it means hail. So is more similar to Ecuador than it is to Chachapoyas or Llamas, for example, the words for wet, cough, or suck. And we find cases where apparently the Chachapoyas Llamas group has gone with the Cusco group. So sipas or shipash for young woman, a word which I assumed did not exist at all in the Ecuadorian group until I went to Colombia, but it turns out it exists there too. So actually what's going on here, it looks like really what we're seeing here is not any kind of innovation, but rather selective retentions. So there will be two or more terms, and then only one of them will be kept by the other varieties. So if we look historically, we see the Cusco and Santo Tomas group has a lot more variation. There's, say, 3 or 4 words for snow and ice that get broken down to just 1 or 2 in the Chachapoyas or Ecuadorian groups. Now, there are three words that do appear to go along with the traditional classification. So words that are shared only with the Ecuadorian group, the Chachapoyas group, and Santo Tomas, and not with any of the Cusco group. However, there are 20 words that are exclusively shared between Santo Tomas and the Cusco group. So less than 1% of variation versus 5% of variation does not seem very convincing. We can look specifically at flora and fauna terms. And again, we see this phenomenon where Cusco and Santo Tomas will have two terms, for example, for deer, and that will be taken up only by only one term in Ecuador, taruga, and only the other term in the Chachapoyas area, luichu. And then we begin to find areas where there is not any correspondences across any of the languages because we're starting to incorporate local Amazonian terms for flora and fauna and so on. For example, in the cases of vulture or in nettle, where we have three different words, chimi, ishanga, and kisa. If we look at kinship, body parts, and artifacts, we see again a complete variation across the types of correspondences. We see quite a few in which the Chachapoyas Lamas group has a conservative term that patterns with the Cusco and Santo Tomas group, whereas in Ecuador, it's variable or some new innovative term. For example, those two preserve the older word for liver, ñati, whereas Ecuador uses the word shungu from heart and then specifies which type of heart. But again, there are no clear patterns here, and sometimes we see the terms completely split between the three groups. So we can see, for example, with forehead, which is usually said in Spanish in Ecuadorian highlands, but there is a native term, urindi, shared among the lowland groups, but it's different from the one shared among the Chachapoyas Lamas groups, and it's different again from the Cusco Santo Tomas group. So what we're seeing emerge from this pattern here in the lexical data is that there are two groups. There is the Quito Minus group that covered a larger area, including all of what's the modern Ecuadorian Amazon, parts of Colombia, and most of the Amazon or Marañón River. And then to the south of there, we find the Chachapoyas Lamas Ucayali group. And those are actually pretty neatly distinguished by the border between the Archdiocese of Quito versus the Archdiocese of Lima, which administered the emissions that were run out of Chachapoyas. So we have two routes, one from Quito down the rivers from the Ecuadorian Andes, and the other one coming across the Peruvian Andes from Lima by way of Chachapoyas. And so these are the two groups, how they break down, and these are more or less the geographical relations we see between them. So in Ecuador, we see that the language was implanted in highland Ecuador by the Incas and the Spanish, and then spread north and then northeast in Colombia, and spread east and southeast down in Ecuador and Peru into the Amazon. And then there's a large gap, and then down south we have Chachapoyas Quechua connected to San Martin Lamas Quechua, and then moving across to the Ucayali watershed. And actually, you do not have to go all the way down the Ucayali River and around the Marañón and back up the Huallaga to get between these places, because in the colonial period, there were actually routes that cut between the two watersheds. So it was actually quite direct to go from Chachapoyas to Lamas and then come out at Ucayali. So if we think about what the traditional class of Ucayali document together as one language called the Ecuador Ucayali branch, and Torrero's version of that was, including more languages, was the Quechua 2B group, which also includes Chachapoyas and Lamas. And the claims for the existence of this group rest on the fact that it's supposed to share features also with the Quechua of Santo Tomas, to the exclusion of Cusco Quechua. So according to the traditional classification, all of these languages should pattern together, and they should pattern with Santo Tomas, and they should pattern against Cusco. But what do we actually see? So in the results, we see that both groups are actually closely related to Cusco Quechua, especially the historical Cusco Quechua, but they're not closely related to each other. They don't seem to have a historical connection with each other. And also that Santo Tomas Quechua does not seem to show an early branching, but at least lexically, it is almost identical with Cusco Quechua. So this quantitative evidence is not supporting the Quechua 2B and 2C distinction. It actually replicates the findings of Grimes 1985, who looked at Torero's database and came to the same conclusions. We can see here that Grimes had a larger difference between Ecuador and Chachapoyas than he had between the entire Southern Quechua 2 languages and Quechua 1 languages, as they're known in the literature. And so Ecuador to Chachapoyas is supposed to be a shallower branch, according to the traditional classification. So here's our result. We have these three groups. We have Ingano, Highland Quechua, Lowland Quechua, and Inga from Pastaza in one group, all closely related to each other. We have Chachapoyas Quechua, San Martin, Lamas Quechua, and Ucayali Quechua, again, closely related to each other. And then we have modern historical Cusco Quechua and Santo Tomas Quechua, closely related to each other. Now, the traditional classification says that we should have all of the northern ones in one group together, and that these should relate closely to Santo Tomas, and that these should be distinguished from the Cusco Quechua. However, what we find is actually these two groups don't have any relation between each other, and they are closely related to the groups in the south. So to conclude, we have these two distinct groups. We have the Quito Minas group that corresponds to the Archbishop of Quito, including these four languages, and then these three languages or varieties in Chachapoyas Lamas that corresponded to the Arzobispado of Lima, and also Chachapoyas, Ucayali being no longer spoken today. And so lexical evidence is pointing to this being two fully independent branches within the Quechuan family and not a single 2B branch, as it has been called in the traditional classification. Well, so if the Ecuadorian and Chachapoyas Lamas Quechuan diffusions are not related to each other and are not particularly related to the so-called coastal Quechua has been claimed, well, what is their real history before they started their original diffusions? And I will leave you today with that question. So thanks to all the members of all of the Quechua, Inga, Ingano, Quechua communities who participated in this in the three different countries, with my different colleagues, getting primary data from them, and the funders that supported the research, and to the institutions that housed it, and also to the Amazonicas organizers for organizing the conference. Thank you.